Hey, I'm Jeremy Jordan. I work as a machine learning engineer at Duo Security, and I don't drink coffee, but I do enjoy tea. My favorite is the Tazo Passion Tea. Big fan of that.
Welcome everybody to another MLOps community podcast. I am your host, Dimitrios, and today I am joined by none other than the incredible co-host, Vishnu. What is happening, my man?
It's your favorite. I'm back.
You know it. So we had the luxury, the pleasure of talking with Jeremy today, which is incredible because I have been hounding this guy. And when I say hounding him, I reach out to him probably once every couple of months to get him onto the podcast. And that has been happening for 2 years. And finally he caved in. So whenever someone is down on their luck and you feel like somebody just rejected you, remember, no does not mean no. It just means not now. In this context. In other contexts, no means no. All right, let's just keep it straight. So, what'd you think, dude? It was a great conversation. Jeremy's awesome. If anybody does not know about his blog, I recommend you check that out right now. Pause this and go and read some of the stuff on his blog because he's an incredible writer. What were your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know Jeremy Jordan, he is a machine learning engineer at Duo Security right now, was previously at a company called Proofpoint, studied material science at NC State, and is overall an extremely prolific machine learning systems and MLOps blogger. His blog, jeremyjordan.me, as like incredible content when it comes to actual practical considerations around how to build machine learning systems, topics on testing, topics on advanced models, topics on infrastructure as code, all kinds of stuff. And that was really the reason that we wanted to bring him on the podcast.
Just as a little accolade side note, he is a maintainer for PyTorch Lightning too.
Right.
He doesn't really talk about that much, but he does it.
Come on,
just another thing to add to that list. He's incredible.
Yeah, he's a core maintainer of it, right? Yeah. So it's a great call out. I really enjoyed it. I've been a fan of Jeremy's work for the last 2 years, actually. Like a lot of what he's written has been extremely useful for me on my ML journey. And I think what I really enjoyed during our conversation was talking about rules engines, funnily enough. I think a big part of what I think I learned in this conversation from hearing about Jeremy was how he thought about rules as an addition and a hedge against the unpredictable behavior of ML systems. That lack of predictability is kind of a feature, not just a bug, right? That's the whole point of these probabilistic systems. And how he thinks about design, using rules engines as sort of additions and hedges around those systems. I thought that was a fascinating area that I'm definitely going to apply at work. What about you?
Yeah, I loved it. And so for me, what is interesting is that it really feels like there is a clear pattern that we have been seeing with some of these greats in the field that is MLOps. And that pattern that I can see now that we've interviewed, I don't know how many of them, hundreds, is that so many use writing as a forcing function to learn about where they have holes in their understanding of something. And so if you are not writing, I've said it before, I think I tweeted out something or I posted on LinkedIn how important writing is for your own development. But if you are not writing, this just is another great example as to why. He goes into it in depth as to how beneficial it is for him to write and for him to see that he doesn't understand something if he cannot re-articulate it in writing. So that was my key takeaway. I loved it. Vishnu, I know you write these days a little bit more, not as much as I wish you wrote. I still think you have like 5 pending blog posts for the MLOps community blog, but whatever, you can't win them all, right?
I do. I still have plenty, but I'm trying to be more prolific like Jeremy.
There you go. So let's get into this full conversation with Jeremy. And while you're at it, if you like this, if you feel that you're getting any value out of this conversation, you know, it would be huge. What would be huge, Vishnu?
Like, subscribe, and review. on YouTube, your favorite podcast app, wherever you can. Is that right, Demetrios?
Leave a review also. I think that was kind of in the yeah, you said that, right? So
Yeah, I
leave a
did.
review is huge. Comment if you're on YouTube. All that stuff is immensely valuable for us as we keep growing the podcast. One thing that Vishnu and I set out to do at the beginning of this year, which is crazy to think that we have hit this goal, is we said we were going to get to X amount of listeners by the end of the year per episode. And I don't think Vishnu has looked at the analytics in a while, but we hit our number. And so I'm probably going to be writing a blog post about it at the end of the year just to tell everyone where we're at as far as numbers and keep a little transparency on it, because I think that is so cool and it is huge. That being said, let's get into the conversation. Dude, it's great to have you on here, and I want to jump into this directly by talking about the NormConf, which is, I think, short form for the Normal Conference. And from what I understand, it is very similar to an idea that our buddy Flavio, who's also a community member, wanted to create in 2020, and he wanted to call it the Boring Conf. Not by any means is your conference boring. That's not the parallel I'm trying to make here. But what I think is interesting is that there's a lot of hype everywhere in machine learning and AI, and every day there's more of it. But you're trying to highlight the stuff that works. And can you just give us a bit of an explanation on what you're doing and why you're doing it?
Yeah, definitely. So the conference started as like a joke tweet by Vicky Boykis. And she tweeted like, "Oh, I'm gonna go start a conference about like not all the sexy hype stuff, but like, the boring practical stuff that makes the world run." And that tweet got so much like positive reception on Twitter. Everyone's like, "Yes, please actually do this." And, we had a group chat going. It was like, well, should we actually do this? So yeah, one thing led to another. We decided to make it a real thing and host this conference. We have a great lineup of speakers on all sorts of fun subjects. And you can check that out at like normconf.com. And it's a free virtual conference that we're hosting December 15th. Just like wanted to have kind of a refreshing take of practitioners talking about the nitty-gritty day-to-day work that sometimes gets overlooked in lieu of all the hype that we see every day.
And you're talking, right? You're giving you're giving a speech or a presentation. Are you giving the keynote? What's your talk about?
Vicky's giving the keynote, which is like
the brainchild.
So it actually is short, not for Normal Conference, but Vicky has this newsletter and kind of brand around like Normcore technology. And so like NormConf is kind of like the Normcore Conference. So very much, fitting into her brand there. And I think it also helped people like quickly that read her newsletter, which is great. And, you should read it, kind of latch on to like what this conference would be about. But yes, I am giving a talk. I am going to give a talk about how rules engines can work together with machine learning. And, I think the common trope is like, yeah, you deploy a heuristic to start that gets you going, and then you replace it all with machine learning. And I've learned kind of working in cybersecurity, like that replace it with machine learning doesn't usually happen. It's usually more like we have a rule system and then we're adding machine learning on top of it, and they work together.
I love that topic. Demetrius, do you have something you want to add there?
Oh, you man.
Okay. All right, perfect. Yeah, because this is actually a topic I'm very much interested in. How rules engines and machine learning systems can play nice together. I think I saw your slides from the threat detection talk that you did at in another MLOps community, Demetrios. It's Chip's unnamed MLOps community to throw it back to a previous meme from one of our podcasts.
So confusing, but whatever.
Yeah. So my first question here is like, when are rules engines good and when are they not? Let's start there because I feel like
Yeah.
this is going to take up the next few minutes.
Definitely. So, especially working in cybersecurity, like one of the main tasks that we work on is threat detection, and being able to detect threats so that we can then stop them from causing harm to users. And a lot of times when like we first learn about a threat, we don't have a ton of data on that threat, but we want to provide protection immediately, like using the domain knowledge that we do have. So rules are great for encoding our domain knowledge or like understanding of a given threat before we have this huge labeled data set that we can go and train a machine learning model. And there's like the landscape of cybersecurity is always evolving because it's like this cat and mouse game. We get better at detecting threats. These like threat actors make money when they can successfully attack somebody and phish their credentials or steal like get access to accounts. So when we get better at detecting and blocking those threats, they get less revenue. So then they're incentivized to implement new threats and vulnerabilities, so that they can increase their revenue. Like these threat actors commonly run this like a business, and they like any good marketing campaign, they like calculate metrics on how successful our threat actor our threat campaign's doing. And so if there's a decrease in their efficiency, they're incentivized to then go find some new loophole or new social engineering attack. So the landscape's always changing, and we have to be able to like adapt to those new threats before we necessarily have a bunch of data to go train a model to detect that threat.
Got it. So I can totally see how this problem is very difficult. But to make sure that I'm understanding, you're sort of saying rules engines are very helpful for encoding what we know about the problem. And what we know about the problem often outstrips the amount of labeled data we have, right? Like if a new threat pattern emerges, you know that as a practitioner before you have a ton of labeled data to be able to train a model. And so you go and implement a rule. Is that right, what I'm hearing there?
Yeah, definitely. And so that's one side of where the rules can be really good. The other side is, say we have both rules and machine learning models that we have deployed. Our machine learning model might introduce some false positives, or we might start blocking benign content. And that's bad. Customers complain about that. It's really easy to quickly remediate that with a rule. And you can do that a lot quicker than it takes to like, okay, let's add this to the labeled data set. And then maybe we need to go collect similar examples and label that and then kick off a model training run. That's just like a longer process. And, ideally you're doing both. So we can improve the model and reduce those false positives as well. But in terms of quickly reacting, a rule engine is much easier and much quicker.
That makes a ton of sense. My sort of basic question here is, how do you implement a rule? Is it a SQL function? Is it a Python function? Like, what is a rule in your world and in your systems?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It kind of depends on the environment. So I've worked at a couple of cybersecurity companies. I'm now at Duo, and a lot of our heuristics right now look like we try to make it very flexible to define. So it's effectively like a Python function. And then if you can write a Python function that adheres to a certain set of conventions of how we input and process the data, then we can take that and deploy it alongside another set of rules and run that in a distributed fashion.
Okay, so you have these rules implemented sort of using Python functions as part of this current system that we're talking about here. I'm asking these questions because this is actually something that I'm thinking about. It's a real problem that I'm kind of trying to face, in terms of, how do we implement a rules engine? And, as a practitioner, as a machine learning practitioner, I immediately jump to a certain problem that I'm focused on, saying, this makes a ton of sense for a rules engine. And the pushback that I got is that, well, how do you manage an ever-increasing number of rules? How do you weight them? And how do you make sure that overall the system doesn't get unwieldy, right? And I was like, okay, you guys are way overcomplicating this, but I don't know how to answer that. And I want to ask you that question, like, how do you manage rules sprawl?
Yeah, that's a good question. And on that on that note particularly, I think one good practice, especially like in my world of cybersecurity, we want to make sure that the rules that we are defining are very high precision. So we can effectively say, like, for when we're trying to detect something, you can just say, like, if any rule fires, then we're going to flag it as malicious and block it. So you don't want to have to deal with like interactions between rules of like, oh, well, this rule is kind of noisy, so I have this other heuristic that like tries to tamp it down. If we can instead, have this union of suite of very high precision rules, that's usually like the most productive outcome. It does limit your ability to like catch everything, because we're like, optimizing for precision can harm recall. But I think that's also where machine learning can complement things really well, is that machine learning can like kind of learn from our big labeled set, kind of generalize better patterns, and uncover threats that like were being missed by these high precision rules. And then you can use, okay, machine learning model flagged this as malicious, but our rules didn't catch it. Was it actually malicious? If so, can we update a rule to then have better coverage for that? So like the two systems can work together quite nicely.
That was the exact question that I wanted to ask next, was how often are you updating or reviewing the rules?
Yeah, it's a continual process in cybersecurity, because the threat landscape changes and evolves so much, and there's always more to be. There's always more like detection capabilities that we can offer. So it's an iterative part of the process of like having good observability over like, okay, what rules are these content flagging, or sorry, what content are these rules flagging, and are they still performing well, or are we missing things? Do we need to using our knowledge of the domain, do we need to add new rules to get better coverage of evolving or new threats?
I had a quick question there as you bring that up. It sounds like there's actually a Martin Fowler post on Rules Engine, as there is on everything. There's a Martin Fowler post, okay, and it's really helpful. It's a really nice short post that he has, and that behavior that you're describing of how rules interact with one another, he calls chaining, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure if that's like an industry standard term, but what you are sort of telling me here is that your system doesn't engage in chaining. It's something that you try to keep these rules pretty separate. Is that correct? What I'm hearing there, or what I'm saying?
It's mostly correct. I think like there is a case where we have like, we'll implement a heuristic that is a bit noisy, and then we'll add kind of like a suppression layer on top of that.
Gotcha.
That is like, we might have a general rule that we write that applies to all customers, or like that we're all users that we're protecting. But then we might have like some suppression logic that depends on the previous behavior of that user or customer. So there is in some cases that like kind of suppression. I think it just kind of like depends on the environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny, we're sitting here and this is an MLOps podcast, and we talk about generative AI, deep learning, and here we are in 2022 talking about the finer points of rules engines. So maybe as much as things change, they always stay the same. But I think this topic is very interesting because the way that you described rules being sort of a front end almost, for your machine learning model, which are in the back end catching more complicated threats, that to me speaks to the question of design and the design of machine learning products and systems, which is a really important component of overall like ML systems development It's something that's under, I think, addressed right now, right? We have a lot of guidelines on how to build a model, how to put it into production now, but we don't really have a lot of guidelines in terms of like how to design an ML system, how to have the fail safes that rules can provide. And that's why I'm so interested in this topic, right? They help prevent the kinds of harms and they help mitigate the kind of risks that we see a lot of times that machine learning systems have. And so I think, I don't know if you find it similarly interesting in that realm, but I think I remember, in one part of your talk that you sort of mentioned something similar in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. I have I really enjoy design thinking. I actually when I was in college was pursuing a minor in art and design just because I really love design thinking, and have always been really interested in how do we design those machine learning products to get that virtuous cycle where you get data and that improves the model, and then better model means more usage and more data, and there's that, I think, nirvana of the data flywheel that can cause a positive feedback loop, and design is really influential in that. And so I love thinking about this area, and specifically in cybersecurity, I think it's interesting to think about how we design our detection systems and how we can protect users. Because I mentioned earlier, for rules, for example, and for blocking models as well. So if you have a model that's going to block content, all of that needs to be super high precision. And that's because we don't want to impose a lot of friction to users. If you're trying to log in to do your work today, and you're blocked, that's very annoying and might lead to you actually just turning off all the cybersecurity protections that we might have. So we need to be low friction and easy to use so people can enjoy getting those protections. And so, we can block in that really high precision regime, but then there's still some content that's in this gray area. It's we're not really sure that it's benign, but we can't be so confident that it's malicious that we feel comfortable blocking it. And so I think it's a really interesting area of how do we provide our users safety in that gray area? And I gave in that talk, I gave a couple of examples. So one, I started my career at Proofpoint. I was there for about 3 years, which is largely an email security provider. And so we're very focused on things like phishing, malware delivery. And one of the products that I've mentioned as this interesting design application in that gray area is, so say we have a link in an email that we're not, it could be suspicious, but we're not confident in blocking it. Instead of just letting the user open that link in their normal browser, Proofpoint has this product called the isolation browser, which still lets you visit the web page, but can prevent you from doing some accidentally leaking your password or other things like that. So it's instead of completely blocking the user from visiting that URL, we can place them in an environment that they can still visit the page, but it's a little more locked down just to for their own protection and safety. And then, similarly, now I'm at Duo Security, which we've largely focused on access security. So we started with two-factor authentication. We now have a whole suite of products like SSO, passwordless authentication, all that fun stuff. So one area where we're kind of trying to design for that gray area of we're not confident blocking a login attempt, but we don't necessarily feel comfortable just letting that through because there's some area of risk associated with that, is we have this concept of risk-based authentication, where depending on the risk that we evaluate associated with a given login attempt, we might restrict the set of factors that you could use to actually authenticate and log in. So, if we have an authentication that looks risky, maybe we don't allow you to get a SMS two-factor authentication code. And maybe we require you to use a YubiKey or a Touch ID to authenticate. So kind of modulating the amount of friction that we provide in the login attempt based on the risk associated with that.
Incredible. That is really cool. And I just want to ask one question there, which is the notion of risk and confidence, right? I think I've seen a lot of work recently from the academic machine learning world about confidence estimation, learning in uncertain realms. Cybersecurity is a highly uncertain realm. From a machine learning development perspective, how do you approach certainty and risk estimation? When the output isn't just 0 or 1.
Yeah, and I think that gets back into like, okay, so we're not designing for binary outcomes of like allow or block. We're designing for this like gradient of possible outcomes. And when we are blocking, we want to be very sure. So we're going to like tune our thresholds to be like very high precision, that we feel confident that we can block on that content. And then in this gray area, I think the best case scenario is we're not really sure. So we want to like try to modulate friction, but we can also observe, like, was the user able to log in? Like, we made them use a more secure factor for logging in. Did they pass that? Did they actually log in? And that's useful feedback for us, so we can kind of like continue to fine tune our system. Or when we increase the friction, did they like, were they unable to log in? And it's a proxy, because it doesn't necessarily tell us that like, oh, that was a malicious login attempt. But it's like a useful signal in combination with other things that we can kind of continue to improve the system over time by collecting data and kind of like observing what happens in that middle ground state.
I want to change gears real fast, because you wrote an incredible blog post recently on testing machine learning and testing models, the difference between testing models, evaluating models, and how to test different models in machine learning. And so I want to dive into that, because I find this topic fascinating in its own right. And it is something that people have come on here to talk about a few times. And it also comes up quite a bit in the MLOps community Slack, so much so that we created a whole channel around testing. And it's not exactly like software testing. And you write all about this in the blog post. Can you just give us a quick overview about the blog post, and then we'll dive into some specifics?
Yeah, definitely. So this blog post was largely inspired by a paper that a coworker had sent me on like behavioral testing of NLP models. And reading that paper, I was like, it resonated a lot with me. That I was reading through that, I was like, yes, we should be doing this. And it kind of got me thinking in that area of, okay, like what does effective testing look like for machine learning? And as I was thinking through that, I was trying to, look at, how do we test software? What are like the best practices that we've established over decades of developing software? And which of those like can map to testing machine learning models as well? Thinking about like, Andre Karpathy's like, software 2.0, like, now it's all the logic is in these models. How do we test that logic? And do so in a way that isn't just like, oh, I made that accuracy or precision number go up, so this is a good model and let's ship it. But how do we actually get a deeper understanding of how that model is performing in a variety of scenarios?
So obviously, I feel like with all of the hype these days around foundational models, it would be interesting to talk about testing those foundational models, because it feels like, and this has happened before when we've been talking to people about foundational models on the podcast, and how there's such a large surface area that things cover, and we are learning as we interact with them. And it's very hard to test those unless you know something that I don't. Have you thought about how you can test these large language models?
Yeah, it is tricky, because when I think about testing, I am often thinking about like, what are the scenarios in the product or in the end application that we want to like understand and characterize that behavior? And there's not like really one application of these foundation models. I think that's the whole point. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, we have this foundation model, this large language model that can be applied for, tons of different tasks, and we can amortize the cost of training this huge model over many, many different applications. So I do think it's tricky, and don't have a magic answer on like, how do you necessarily like comprehensively test that. I've seen more papers coming out where it's just like the answer is to have a bunch of different evaluations of like enumerating, here's all the different ways that you could apply this model, and data sets to evaluate those models on. And I mean, that seems like a reasonable approach. It's better than just looking at what's the loss function for that large language model that you trained on. It's like giving you a better peek at what are the downstream performance characteristics that you might care about. But I think it's something that we'll continue to figure out as these models are applied in more and more settings.
Yeah. And you did mention something that I also want to just call out, which I thought was fascinating when it comes to the difference between model evaluation and model testing, and how the evaluation will cover metrics and plots, which summarize the performance on a validation test or on a validation or test data set. And then the model test involves explicit checks for behaviors that we would expect the model to follow. So it's almost like, and that instinctively makes me go to monitoring, right? And monitoring, it has become a very big business in MLOps. And when you look at the differences there, do you feel like that should be encompassed by a monitoring tool, or is that something that you're doing beforehand and you're just making sure that when you're creating this, you go through the right checks?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I tend to think of like the model testing side as analogous to like unit tests, where you have a code base, like say software 1.0, you have a code base, and that code base is evolving. We're making changes to it, and say you make a change that breaks something. Ideally, there's a unit test that starts failing, and so like you make your change, you put up a PR, you see the PR failed because there's this unit test failing, or maybe you run the test locally. And that unit test kind of tells you exactly, this is the part of the code that you changed that is now like breaking logic that we care about. And you can kind of, in a targeted way, go back to your code and update that to make sure that, we can make all those unit tests pass. And that's what I think can sometimes get missed if we're like now looking at software 2.0 and we're just looking at evaluation metrics. Like the underlying logic that's baked into these models might be changing, and the behavior can change in some ways that might be hidden from just looking at the metrics themselves. So if there's like behavioral aspects that we care about, I think it's important to be able to like try to wrap that into a test. So when we now ship a new model update, like, and that's where I think the tests are very useful, is like in making that decision of like, okay, we trained a new model, we think it's better than the existing model, but we want to understand, like, when we deploy this model, is it like, what's going to happen? So being able to try to like take slices of that logic and evaluate and like, or test that individually helps us get like a better picture of it's kind of like report card of like, here's what the model's good at, here's what the model's not good at.
One question I have here relates to how you apply some of these ideas into your day-to-day, work and in your, in your day-to-day practicing of machine learning, right? The paper that you referenced, a checklist was, I think, the testing system that's referenced there. We now have Recklist. There's all kinds of new packages, tools, and suggestions that come out from academia frequently, right? Hey, here's the new thing you should be doing, for your system. And I find it as a practitioner very overwhelming, right? It's hard enough to do the basics. It's hard enough to have a good perspective on, well, what's the sensitivity and specificity I need for the task, let alone incorporate new kinds of sophisticated testing and other sorts of practices that people are correctly suggesting we do. How do you approach, making sure you're focusing on the fundamentals and adding some of these newer, more cutting edge techniques in your work, in your day-to-day at Duo?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is like all those like really great suggestions, like they don't always make it to what we're actually using. And that testing blog post was really interesting because a lot of the blog posts I write to kind of like learn about a given area. That one was a little unique in that like, I read that paper and it was really more of like thinking like, how could this be done? What would like an ideal setup look like for like controlling, like having reliable, robust rollouts of machine learning models, and like what should we be doing? But like when I wrote that blog post, that's not what I was doing at the time. I'm still not necessarily following everything in that. It's been cool because I wrote that blog post, and then I think I had some people reach out that like, hey, this was really interesting. Like we're actually starting a company around this, and it's cool to like put an idea out there in the world, and it all their credit goes to their like papers or the authors of that paper that just like got me thinking about this. And I just wrote down some thoughts and put up pretty figures and shared it around. But it's cool to like for people to put stuff out in the world. It's like, here's an idea of what things could look like, and other people can kind of like take that and build the tools that are necessary to actually be able to use that in practice.
It's like that saying, the cobbler has no shoes, or what's that saying? Is it something like that? Am I going? No, is that a saying only in another language?
The emperor has no clothes.
No, it's not that one. It's well, whatever. It's more like do as I say, not as I do. And I swear there was like the cobbler's wife has no shoes or something. I don't know. I'll look it up and get back to you on that. But
it
anyway.
Sounds like the phrase like don't trust a skinny chef, like
Yeah.
along those same lines.
Oh, that is also a great one.
We found the saying.
No, I swear. The
I know you wanted to ask Dimitrios about Jeremy's writing, and I feel like this is a good segue in, considering we just talked about this blog post. Take it away.
Yeah, exactly. And the trope, or I just Googled it, it is the cobbler's children have no shoes.
Aha.
It's an actual saying. I did not just make that up. It's been around for a while. So do you all understand what it means, though? It's basically like the cobbler, who is a shoemaker, doesn't spend the time and attention in his own household to make shoes for his kids. And it kind of feels like that. It's like, yeah, you put that blog post out there and it's very aspirational in ways, but then you're not doing everything, but you see what is the important piece around it. So segueing that into your other blog posts and the other writing that you do, how common is this? Are you doing this often? Where you will write about stuff just so that you can start to implement it, or maybe you recognize that, hey, it's here now, I'm going to implement it into what I'm doing at work? Or how does that process even look?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like I mentioned, that testing ML blog post is a bit unique in that area. Like most of the time I'm writing a blog post to learn about a given area. So I recently wrote one on Terraform because like at the beginning of the year, I was like, I need to know this technology better. I use it a lot at Duo for like rolling out infrastructure now that I've learned it. But I use writing as a learning tool. And I think this started because like I started my journey into machine learning after graduating from university. I got my degree in material science. But then I was kind of like seeing all the cool stuff happening in machine learning. And my material science research was like sort of trending in that direction. I started doing more like computational research, like simulating molecular structures and observing different, physical properties of that. So I was like trending in that direction, but I was like, machine learning, this stuff is way too cool. Like, I want to be doing this. So after I graduated, I did a self-study to kind of like build up the foundation and like make my way into the field. And because I was doing a self-study, like, there wasn't tests or anything to check and make sure I was understanding things well. And I found it really useful to write a blog post and kind of like force myself to teach myself. Like my audience most of the time when I'm writing is like myself 6 months ago. And forcing myself to kind of like teach and capture those moments like right after I learn them. I think when you're learning a new subject, it takes effort, and it like doesn't always come right away. And you're thinking on this or like trying to piece things together, and then usually like there are a couple insights that help make things click. So I try to capture that in my writing as well, because then I say I don't use Terraform for a while, and my skills in that atrophy. I can always come back to that blog post and like very quickly get back up to speed on the technology. So I use writing as a learning tool, and have found that when I force myself to write, I very commonly will identify like gaps in my understanding. Like when you have to try to teach something and make a cohesive narrative about a given subject, you realize like, oh wait, I don't understand this as well as I thought I did. And then you have to dig deeper and go back and revisit that.
I like the idea around it being a checkpoint for you, so that you always can come back to that and be like, oh yeah, all right, cool, that's where I was.
Yeah. And like some of the subjects I've written about, like the Terraform blog post, for example, there's so much great content about Terraform that when I was first, like deciding, okay, I want to like, really spend the time to know this technology well, I wasn't necessarily planning to write a blog post, but I decided to. And I was thinking, there's so much great content out there. Like, what's my blog post going to add? But I wrote one, and I think the thing that adds is it's in my voice. So I get the most benefit from that, is because then 2 years from now I can go read something in my own words, and that's always gonna like make it's always gonna be like the most efficient way to relearn something, if it's in your own voice, and like you frame the ideas in a way that like makes sense to you.
Yeah, the way I think about it is, I use writing very similarly, and it's kind of like the Amazon mindset of be the first and best customer for your own product, right? Like that's what Amazon was for AWS, the first and best customer for distributed computing and all the cloud services, and it's the same way with with writing. So I'm just a regular Jeffrey Bezos over here. But what I wanted to ask is, you have these great blog posts, which I have been reading for going on 2 years now. I'm kind of curious, where do you post them? How do you go about getting the word out? I just, maybe you do a lot, maybe you don't, just curious.
Yeah. So I post them. I like host my own blog. It's powered by Ghost, which is an open source blogging platform, started by some developers at WordPress like left and started Ghost. So I use Ghost, and I host it myself, which I like because that gives me the most like control like over how that information is presented. Like when I was starting, Medium was just entering the scene, and a lot of people were publishing on there. But I'm knowing what Medium has turned into. Like there's this flood of content, especially a lot written by beginners. I'm glad that I decided to just start my own blog, and
you dodged a bullet.
Yeah,
for real.
And now I have like my little corner of the internet that I can just publish and control what that looks like. I think there was a second part to your question though.
In terms of just where you distribute the content, is it?
Oh,
do you
yeah.
post on LinkedIn, Twitter? Are you active on those places? Kind of curious.
Yeah. So usually I will just like write up a blog post and then tweet a link out, be like, hey, I've been learning about X and I wrote a blog post on it. And, sometimes that gets shared around. I also like do get a fair amount of organic traffic to my site, just like people do Google searches. It can be cool sometimes. Like my old roommate was going through the Georgia Tech online master's program in machine learning, and he was learning about, I don't know, like variational autoencoders. And so he was just like Googling it to, do his homework and like learn about it. And my blog post like showed up and it was like one of the top results. He's like, wait, I live with that guy. So it can be cool like to hear about those scenarios where like I think actually one of my other friends sent me a screenshot because he was Googling variational autoencoders and my blog post like was occurring above the Wikipedia page on variational autoencoders. And he was like, wow, this is so cool. I was like, yeah, that's awesome. So it's a mix of just like tweeting out a link once I publish, as well as people are Googling this stuff all the time. And like I get organic traffic from that.
And it is valuable if you didn't even have to do any SEO or anything specifically, and it is landing above the Wikipedia page.
I think Ghost does some SEO under the scenes that I don't know about. But yeah, I'm not like doing any of that.
That's incredible.
I was just going to ask a very quick question, which is what has been your most popular blog post? Has it been the variational autoencoders one? Like, what's the one that got the most traffic?
That's a good question. I have analytics on the site, but I like very rarely actually look at them. So I'm not sure. I would guess the variational autoencoders one is probably up there. Now I'm kind of curious. I'll probably look, pull up the Google Analytics and see.
You're leaving all kinds of advertising revenue on the table, man. You could just throw some banner ads on there like it's 1999 and get all kinds of
Yeah, but like I get a ton of value out of that blog already, like just from me, like the active writing and learning, but also all the people that I meet that like come across my blog and reach out. I think that's like how we got connected. So I get a ton of value already from it. And I like keeping it ad free. I was actually, I used like ad blockers on like Chrome or whatever.
Yep. As do most of us, I think.
Yeah. But I don't have ad blockers on my phone. And there was one time when I was like scrolling through one of my blog posts and I went down to the bottom where like I have a Discus plugin for comments and I saw that they were inserting ads like above the comment section. And I was like so embarrassed because I didn't know, like in my browser, I didn't see any of those ads. And like,
of course,
it just, I don't know, it feels impure to have those ads being shown. So I figured out there was a way to like disable it, but it was like nested behind 3 different panels within Discus's settings.
Oh man. Well, yeah, I think it's been like I reached out to you in 2020 to try and get you on the pod. And you were like, I don't have anything to talk about. And then I kept seeing you put out these blog posts. And I'm like, come on, man, we'll just talk about your blog. Doesn't matter. Like, I'm sure you have a lot to say and you've been learning about a bunch of cool stuff. And finally, now I'm going to pat myself on the back because it was a lot of persistence on my side. It was far too much persistence. But I found out that this is your first podcast. I know in my heart that it is not going to be your last. Jeremy, it's been awesome getting to interview you and getting to learn from you. It's so cool to see what you're doing, how you're doing it. And I love the work that you're doing and putting out there. So keep it up, man. And then everybody that is listening, please go and sign up for NormConf. It is free. There's no excuse not to. It is happening next week. I think, in 2 weeks.
No, 2 weeks.
December 15th. December 15th. That means we got to do some fast turnaround on this episode that we're editing because it was going to take longer than 2 weeks, but we're going to make sure that people can hear this by next week so that we can get this out and everyone can know about NormConf. Thanks, dude. This was cool.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, great for this podcast to be my first podcast experience.
We are
There
thrilled
we go.
that we
Hopefully.
finally got to interview you. Thanks for joining, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Yes,
likewise.
hopefully we did not let you down, and it was all that you were expecting it to be. I know you were a little nervous because you wanted to prep, and podcasts, you don't need to prep. That's the beauty of it. You just get to chat with us.
Yeah. Well, it was a great conversation. I enjoyed it.
Right on, man.